I wasn't investigating World's Fairs when I found this. I was trying to explain something simpler. Why every major exposition from 1851 to 1915 was built on land that had been cleared in ways that made no logistical sense. Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, Paris. The official story is always the same. Temporary exhibition structures built in months, torn down immediately after. But look at the photographs. These weren't temporary structures. The columns were load-bearing stone. The facades were ornate cast iron. The interior spaces rivaled any permanent building in the world, then or now. And every single one of them was demolished within 2 years of opening. Not repurposed, not converted, demolished. And on the cleared land, a new city arose, one that needed official records, official maps, and official histories to explain where it came from. Blueprints for the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition show a city of stone and steel, not the throwaway plaster pavilions described in official accounts. The administration building alone required more than 23 million pounds of steel, according to engineering summaries held in the Chicago Historical Society's archives. The Palace of Fine Arts, the Transportation Building, the Electricity Building, each was drawn up with full steel skeletons, cast iron columns, and roof trusses designed to span up to 360 feet. Construction ledgers from the Miller and Turner firm, though only partially digitized, list iron and concrete quantities on a scale that dwarfed most American civic projects of the era. In St. Louis, the Palace of Electricity was built atop concrete arches stretching 68 feet, dimensions more typical of a railway station than a temporary fairground. The Missouri State Archives preserve fragments of the 1904 contract specifying reinforced concrete by the ton and delivery schedules that extended months beyond the fair's opening. In Philadelphia, the 1876 main building's ironwork, 3,200 tons by the official construction report, was engineered to support a glass roof covering 21 acres. The building committee minutes, cited in the University of Pennsylvania's collections, state plainly, the structures are to be dismantled after the centennial, but the material choices suggest a different story. Daniel Burnham, the renowned architect and engineer behind the Chicago Fair, wrote in 1892, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." His vision, realized in the White City's monumental halls, demanded foundations sunk deep in reclaimed marshland and superstructures that could withstand Chicago's notorious winds. Surviving blueprints from Burnham and Root's office detail brick vaults, load-bearing stone and steel columns, features that, by any practical measure, belong to buildings meant to last. Yet every official guidebook, every press release, insisted on the temporary nature of these marvels. The contradiction is stark. Structures built to endure, erased within months. The absence of full contractor ledgers and detailed demolition accounts leaves a gap in the record, but the surviving architectural evidence points to an intent and an investment far beyond what the temporary narrative can explain. City council minutes, legal decrees, and demolition contracts from the era reveal a pattern that goes beyond practical necessity or accidental loss. In April 1894, the Chicago City Council met in a special session and voted to authorize the removal of nearly every structure from the White City, even as preservationists pleaded for exceptions. The official record, filed as B03-189-394 in the municipal archives, describes demolition as a matter of public safety and urban renewal, but the language is blunt. All buildings not explicitly exempted must be razed within months. Daniel Burnham, the fair's chief architect, received the council's order by courier while the final exhibits were still being packed for shipment. Demolition crews began assembling before the fair's gates had even closed to the public. This was not an isolated case. In Paris, the Ministry of Commerce issued a decree on May 31, 1889, requiring that most exposition structures be removed within 3 months of closing. The order, published in the Journal Officiel, set a fixed deadline for the teardown, with penalties for delay. San Francisco followed suit in 1915, passing Ordinance No. 87 to 1915, just weeks after the Panama Pacific International Exposition ended. The ordinance mandated that all temporary buildings be cleared by April 30, 1916, leaving little room for negotiation or public debate. In each instance, the official rationale cited fire risk, health, or the restoration of public land, but the timing and uniformity of the orders suggest a deeper logic at work. The pattern extends even further back. In 1840, the Antarctic Treaty, remarkably ahead of its time, prohibited permanent settlement and required the removal of all structures after scientific expeditions, setting an early precedent for the deliberate erasure of human presence in contested or transitional spaces. The World's Fairs, though not governed by an international treaty, adopted a similar administrative rigor. Demolition was not a response to decay or vandalism. It was a prescripted act, embedded in the very contracts and council resolutions that authorized construction in the first place. Across continents and decades, this choreography repeats. Fairgrounds built on land reclassified as wasteland, monumental structures rising in stone, steel, and glass, then swept away with bureaucratic efficiency. The absence of salvage records, the lack of detailed demolition accounts, and the speed with which these spaces were cleared point to a system that valued erasure as much as spectacle. The official story insists these were celebrations of progress, destined to vanish. The paper trail tells another story, one of institutional actors, legal instruments, and a striking synchronicity that leaves the question of motive open, but the fact of erasure undeniable. Surveyors' maps and city planning documents from the decades before each fair tell a story at odds with the official record. In Philadelphia, the 1872 Fairmount Park plat describes the future exposition grounds as swampy meadow, yet property deeds from the same period record brickworks, stables, and a rail spur crossing the site. Photographs preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society show fenced gardens and outbuildings standing where the main exhibition hall would later rise. In Chicago, the Jackson Park Survey of 1885 labels large sections as marsh and vacant land, but overlays with insurance maps reveal a patchwork of cottages, boathouses, and even a small hotel along the park's western edge. St. Louis follows a similar pattern. The 1902 deed for the fairgrounds lists the land as unimproved woodland, yet county tax rolls from the same year note active dairy farms and tenant houses within the condemned parcels. These discrepancies are not isolated. Each city's pre-fair documentation recasts developed, inhabited land as blank or marginal, smoothing the way for mass clearance. The language, swamp, meadow, vacant, appears again and again in council minutes and legal notices, erasing traces of prior use in the official account. The result is a paper landscape that justifies sweeping demolition even as photographs and tax records tell a different story. The planners and surveyors who drew these lines remain largely anonymous, but their work reshaped how these spaces would be remembered and whose histories would be recorded or lost. Census tables from the decades surrounding each fair reveal more than just shifting city boundaries. They document a surge in population that official histories rarely address. In Chicago, the 1890 census records a staggering 35% jump over the previous decade, an increase that outpaces both birth rates and documented immigration. Labor rosters, though incomplete, estimate over 40,000 workers brought in for fair construction alone. But the numbers do not end with adult laborers. Orphan train manifests from the Children's Aid Society list more than 2,400 children arriving in Chicago during the Exposition years, and St. Louis records show 1,800 orphans processed through local depots between 1904 and 1906. These children, often unnamed in city records, were distributed to farms and factories across the Midwest, vanishing from official ledgers almost as soon as they arrived. Contractor lists where they survive show a workforce drawn from far beyond city limits, many hired on short-term contracts and dismissed once the fair closed. The demographic spike, the influx of untraceable orphans, and the revolving door of transient laborers all point to a human tide that swept through these cities, leaving only faint traces in the archives. The scale of this movement raises a difficult question. What social fabric was replaced, and whose stories were left unrecorded as the fairgrounds rose and fell? Inside the official catalogs of the St. Louis Fair, the Philippine Reservation is described in careful detail. Every hut, every daily schedule, every staged ritual. But the names of 1,024 Filipino men, women, and children on display are nowhere to be found. The only surviving brochure tucked away in a university archive lists ethnic groups, not individuals. After the closing ceremony, the exhibit's population simply vanishes from the record. Immigration cards are missing, missionary society files end abruptly, and no repatriation lists have surfaced. This pattern repeats across the fairs. Chicago's Anthropology Building, which once housed hundreds of indigenous and colonized people, left behind no participant registry, no census, not even a ledger of daily rations. Archivist memos from the period reference permanent storage for the exhibit files, yet box numbers lead to empty shelves. In Philadelphia, the city's permit log for the Centennial exhibition contains a gap, pages torn out, dates skipped, the demolition permits for entire blocks now lost. Contractor ledgers for the main fairground structures are either missing or never accessioned. What survives are fragments: a faded group photograph, a single unsigned letter, a catalog entry with no names attached. The silence is not accidental. Across 3 cities, the disappearance of human exhibit records, the absence of demolition permits, and the missing contractor ledgers form a void, one that swallows both the physical traces of the fairs and the identities of those displayed within them. The archival record ends not with a summary, but with a blank page. Today, official records still define what counts as history and what disappears. As archives remain incomplete and urban myths persist, the boundary between progress and erasure blurs. The story of our cities is never neutral. What we inherit depends on what we're willing to question. Share your perspective below.